Dark Side of the Ring this past week tackled the story of Superfly Jimmy Snuka and the mysterious death of Nancy Argentino in 1983. The second Nancy to play the role of victim here in these first 4 episodes. I thought they did a good job of recapping the key events, but there were little details left out that I've covered here on the podcast before, that certain newspaper articles have gone into, in the past. And I also think the role, frankly, of Vince McMahon the role that he possibly played in making this case go away back in 83 does not get enough attention. I didn't learn too much in the way of new information I didn't already know coming in, although there were a few things. I mean, for example, the Tonga Kid part and the chief of police, seeming surprised to learn about there being a third person in the car when Snuka and Nancy were driving to Allentown, which sounds like the sort of thing you would think that he would know about. They obviously were not able to interview either of the parties involved because they're both dead. But they did interview Snuka's widow, Carol. I think the two of them got married in 2004, I believe. I don't think they said on the show, but this was not the woman that he was married to back when he was dating Nancy. They interviewed 2 of Nancy's sisters who met Jimmy and were around him and just thought he was very, very weird. And in fact, according to one of them, he even threatened one of them at one point when he was over at the house by gesturing that he would like to grab her around the throat. Nancy said, "Oh, don't worry, that's just him being him." Don Morocco, who was working a program with Snuka at the time, big money program between the two of them back in 83 for the Intercontinental title. And he was also at the George Washington Motor Lodge where they were staying the night Nancy died. They found one of the paramedics on the scene who treated Nancy that night. That was kind of a big get, to get somebody who actually worked on her and was on the scene that night. They talked to Irv Mushnick, wrestling author and historian. He's written extensively, probably more than any other person. And I think he did a book on it. Irv Mushnick has written about this story over the years. He's the nephew. He is related to the legendary promoter Sam Mushnick. And the reporters were interviewed as well. The reporters who co-authored the story for the Allentown Morning Call on the 30th anniversary of Nancy's death. It was that newspaper story that spurred a second look, a re-examination of the case, and ultimately led to Jimmy Snuka being charged 2 years later, back in 2015, with third-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter. Third-degree murder is sometimes thought of as a crime of passion. That's generally how it's sort of looked at. Snuka was 72 years old when he was finally charged. They say justice delayed is justice denied. You may have heard that expression before. Well, that rings true in this case, because he never did have to stand trial on those charges. He died 2 weeks after they were dropped, when a judge ruled that he was not competent enough to stand trial for her murder. 2 months before that, he had been diagnosed with stomach cancer. And I think it was 2 weeks after that is when he passed away. Now, the key word there is murder. It was not until 2013 that the contents of her autopsy report were even made public. People couldn't get their hands on it. And when they finally were, we learned that the coroner ruled that her death should be investigated as a homicide until proven otherwise. It was this big bombshell. And the DA's office out there in Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, they refused to allow the coroner to release their report for 30 years. 30 years! They would not release that report. And the Morning Call found it in a warehouse somewhere in the Federal Archives. That's how they were finally able to get their hands on it. It was part of the civil suit that the family brought against Snuka. And the coroner's report, the autopsy report, was introduced as, I guess, evidence into that case. That's how they were finally able to get their hands on it. There's a lot about this case that never made any sense. And watching the episode did nothing to make their handling of the case feel any less shady. If anything, it made them look even shadier. Snuka's popularity at that time, it was greater than anybody else in the company. Probably until Hogan returned. Hogan didn't come back until the end of 83, won the championship at the beginning of 84, and that was the beginning of the Hulkamania boom in WWE. But Snuka, up to that point, I mean, maybe aside from Andre, who is still, I think, a touring attraction at that point, Snuka was, for all intents and purposes, the top babyface in that promotion. That's how big of an attraction Jimmy Snuka was. You know, the peak moment of his career came after Nancy died. It was that big dive off the top of the steel cage in Madison Square Garden with Don Morocco. That was 5 months after Nancy died. And given Snuka's popularity and that being the big climax of their feud, it's surprising to think that Jimmy Snuka never won the IC title from Don Morocco, that he didn't win the championship that night. You know, the Intercontinental title was on the line. Snuka actually lost the match. You know, he had hit Morocco. Morocco, you know, went into the cage door and kind of fell out of the ring. It was kind of a fluky win. But Morocco actually won the match and retained the title. The big dive off the top didn't happen until after the match was over. I think one of the reasons he may not have won the championship that night was because of this dark cloud hanging over his head from this incident 5 months earlier. And yeah, to be fair, it probably had as much or even more to do with his drug abuse at the time and how crazy he was, strung out on coke and all this other stuff that people were saying. But I don't think you can discount the other stuff playing a role either. So they talked to Don Morocco. They talked to Fatu, not that Fatu, but Tonga Kid, talking about Jimmy as a wrestler. And, you know, they talk about how life on the road can be very boring. And, you know, Fatu confirms that Snuka had a girlfriend. He had basically like a road wife, a road girlfriend with him, and couldn't remember her name. And the producer said, "Oh, was that Nancy?" And he goes, "Oh, yes, it was. It was Nancy. That was her." And so we meet Lorraine. Lorraine is Nancy's older sister. Nancy, she grew up in Brooklyn. She was a Brooklyn girl. She was a beautiful woman. I mean, from all of the photos that I've seen of her, all the photos they dug up here for this episode, she's a very pretty girl. Very young. She was in her early 20s at the time when she met Snuka. And how she met Snuka was she had a friend named Ellen. Ellen was engaged at the time to Johnny Rodz. Johnny Rodz was, I'd call him like a perennial job guy, but that kind of is what he was like in WWF at the time. And now he's got his school. He's trained a whole bunch of wrestlers that, you know, you would all know. I had a friend who worked for Johnny and would do some of his independent shows. And so I was there at Gleason's gym watching a lot of the shows that Johnny would put on. So Johnny Rodz was a known name back then. And I guess he was engaged to Ellen. Ellen would take Nancy to the shows and they would be backstage. And one day she met Jimmy Snuka. Now, Buddy Rogers had managed Snuka when he went from heel to babyface. And so he also managed him on the road, drove him around. Well, he didn't want that job anymore. And the reason he didn't want that job anymore is because he told Vince McMahon he was doing too much coke. He's doing too much cocaine. He's in the car. He's driving erratically. He can't do this. Or if he wasn't driving, maybe he was in the passenger seat, but he's in the car doing cocaine. He was getting out of control. He couldn't take it. He didn't want to be around that anymore. So Nancy ended up with that job that Buddy Rogers used to have. She would plan all of his travel. She would make sure he would get to the shows on time. So they interviewed another one of her sisters, Louise, talked about some of the things the family started to notice with Jimmy. That's when she told the story of being at home one day and Jimmy put his hand up to her throat, kind of in this threatening position, like he wanted to choke her because I guess she dared to speak up. She was trying to start a conversation and he didn't want to hear it. So then Nancy came upstairs and, you know, Louise tells her, "You got to get rid of this guy." And she's defending him. And, "Oh, he was just high." Jimmy's just high. He's working too hard. He's very stressed. He's very high. Snuka then, according to the sister, comes upstairs. He feels bad about what happened. He tries to make a peace offering and hands her a little bag of cocaine. She says, "I don't want that. You can keep it." It was the 80s. To be fair, it was the 80s. Cocaine was aplenty in wrestling, in sports, Hollywood. So Fatu says that Jimmy was very possessive. None of the guys had any kind of relationship with her. She did date Hulk Hogan at one point. I assume that must have been before she hooked up with Snuka. But the news broke to Nancy's family. They learned that Jimmy was married. And Nancy, told them that he and his wife, they're not living together anymore. I mean, you've heard examples of this before. he doesn't love her anymore. Their marriage is over. They're living apart. It's okay. So they interviewed Kevin Amerman. He writes for the Morning Call in Allentown. He shared the infamous story of Jimmy Snuka allegedly assaulting Nancy at the, they didn't identify. It was a Howard Johnson motor lodge in New York, I think upstate New York. This was a few months before her death. So she died in May. This was in January. This is quite the story. Nancy had called her sister saying that they were in a fight. She wanted to come home. She was hysterical. The hotel manager, and I'm sprinkling in more details here from other articles because they left a lot of details out of this story. So the hotel manager had to call the cops because Snuka was assaulting her. People were complaining that they could hear a woman screaming through the walls. That's how loud it was. So he calls the cops. And again, I thought it was kind of crazy they didn't get into all these details because this story was made to be told on TV. Like if I'm a producer, I love a story like this, like as far as all the little detail, but I guess they only had so much time. So I'll tell it. The police report states that when the cops arrived, they found Snuka naked. And he was dragging Nancy down a hallway by her hair. It's almost 2 o'clock in the morning. He's buck naked. She's wearing only a bedsheet. And she is screaming bloody murder to try to get away from this guy. This is a front page story in the Syracuse paper after it happened. So the cops get there, and Snuka forces her back into the room and he shuts the door. And I think he put a pair of underwear on at that point. Shuts the door, refuses to open it. He refuses to talk to the cops. They're trying to communicate with him. He doesn't want to talk to them. She's in the room. She's still screaming. She wants to get away from him. He's screaming. He won't let her leave. He's basically got her trapped in there. So the deputies call for backup. You know it's bad when they have to call for backup. And they force the door open and they try to push Snuka back because he's standing right in the doorway. Snuka shoves one of the sergeants up against the wall, which is never a good idea. Another cop takes his nightstick. He starts to choke Jimmy with it. They managed to get one handcuff on his wrist. They were at least able to do that. They got one handcuff. They said this guy had superhuman strength, whatever he must have been on. Superhuman strength. 9 officers and 1 police dog is what it took to finally subdue Jimmy Snuka that night. And the dog, it bit one of the cops, but the dog bit Snuka twice. And Nancy told the cops he got angry with her because she wasn't paying him enough attention while they were watching some kind of movie or TV show. They hit him with a whole slew of charges. And then in April, a month before Nancy died, they dropped the charges. And in exchange, he pleaded guilty to harassment. He apologized to the cops. He donated $1,500 to the local Ronald McDonald House. And that's because Nancy, in her deposition, I guess, refused to press charges against him. She refused to say, oh, he didn't hit me. She told the cops, he didn't assault me that day. He's never assaulted me any day. It's all good. Just one big misunderstanding, I guess. Classic case. Sadly, you hear about examples of this happening all the time. Now, in his book, Snuka said that he never hurt her. I never hurt that girl, yeah. And I'm Batman. You tell me which is more believable. So, the two of them, they're staying at the George Washington Motor Lodge in Allentown, which is where WWE taped a lot of television back then. This is in May of '83. They drive to Allentown. They stay at the Motor Lodge. Because back then in Allentown, and some of these places, they would have these long marathon taping. I mean, they would tape hours and hours of television. So she's in the room. Snuka comes back to the room, I guess, in between tapings. Finds her in bed, not feeling well. So he left to go back to TV. At some point, he was having a drink. He was drinking, I think, at the bar maybe with Don Morocco and Mr. Fuji. But he leaves, and when he comes back later that night, he finds her in bed, and she is gasping for air. She is oozing yellow fluid from her nose and mouth. Now, the paramedic they interviewed is this woman, Shirley Reeve. She was one of the paramedics on scene who got called in. Snuka was panicking. He called an ambulance. She was called to respond to an unconscious female at the hotel. She says her pupils were dilated. That told her that she had some kind of brain trauma. was not consistent with her just laying in bed. There was some kind of brain trauma here. Snuka told them, oh, they must have been wrestling a little too rough the night before, and she hit her head by accident. He claimed that she was kind of groggy, and so he let her rest, and he went to the TV tapings, and then he saw that she was breathing weird, and he called an ambulance. Now, at the hospital, Snuka told no less than 4 different people that he pushed Nancy and she fell and hit her head. Okay, so the cops interview all of these people at the ER. They all tell the same story that Snuka told them. Snuka later says they all misunderstood him. They all misunderstood what he was saying. Brother, they don't hear too good, brother. They misunderstand me, brother. So the ER doctor that the cops interviewed in his statement said that Snuka also told him that at some point after the fall, they were fooling around again, and he was giving her what he said Snuka called some light slaps to the face. I guess all these people must just be lying. Jimmy's telling the truth. They're all making it up. So in the morgue, the cops talk to the deputy coroner, and he tells them that her body has several black and blue marks. By the next morning, Snuka's story has changed. His new story is that on their way to Allentown, Nancy had to go to the bathroom. So they pulled over and she got out. She goes into the bushes and she squats to do her business. And on the way back to the car, Jimmy is saying, hey, come on, let's go. We got to go. And she's rushing back to the car. She slips and falls backwards and hits her head on the concrete. He told them that she had a real bad concussion. And when he saw that, he said that he slapped her across the face to get her to come to again. That's always a great way to treat somebody with a concussion. Let's smack him across the face. Yeah, that'll help. So Nancy's family, they talk about her viewing. This is insane. They talk about her viewing for the body and how Buddy Rogers showed up with Snuka. He was leading Snuka around. He was very distraught. He went up to the casket. He's crying on the casket. He had to be pulled off of the casket by Nancy's father. And one of the sisters says that the only thing Snuka said to them, didn't apologize, he didn't say anything other than he told her mother, he told Nancy's mom, her daughter is dead in the casket. And according to the sister, Snuka goes up to the mother and says, she looks terrible. And the sister says, of course she looks terrible. She was dead. So they say that the Undertaker told now, when they said the Undertaker, I had the same thought a lot of you probably did when you were watching it. I said, the Undertaker, what the hell's he doing there? This was long before he was the Undertaker. We're talking about the actual Undertaker. The Undertaker told the family that she looked so bad because they had a hard time because she had this massive bruise around her neck. She had a lot of abrasions all over her body. And that's not funny. I mean, she was so beat up that the reason she looked bad, which I guess she must have in the eyes of some of the people there, was because they had to do a real, it was a real tough job to touch her up and make her look presentable to the family. Which, of course, sounds just like somebody who tripped and fell and hit the back of their head. So in the Morning Call article, it said the family thought that, Snuka might show up for the funeral the next day. He never showed up. They never saw him again. They interviewed Carol Snuka, Jimmy's widow, his most recent wife. I think it might be his third wife. Was he married 3 times? So they interviewed Carol. And she mentions, people would make comments about what Jimmy did. Look, when Snuka got back into the ring in the summer of '83, it's not like some people didn't know what was going on. I mean, I know the internet wasn't around and information was not as easily accessible. It might have been a big story in Allentown, in that area, but people in New York or people in other places of the country, they may not know that Jimmy Snuka was involved in the death of this woman, or that, he was present and this incident occurred. But when he showed up to Madison Square Garden not long after, there were people in the crowd chanting murderer at him. So some people knew. And Carol said people would make comments to Jimmy about what he did. And she asked him about it. And again, this is years after it happened when the two of them got married, but she asked him about it. And she said all Jimmy told her was he knew what happened and he knew what he did and that his God knew what happened. That's what he said. His God knew what happened. Then they interview Frederick Conjure, the former police chief or chief of police, whatever, for Whitehall Township. He tells us that all the stories floating around are obviously not enough to charge somebody with murder. Everybody's got their story and conspiracy theory, but clearly it wasn't enough since he wasn't charged with murder. He believes the person who, the cop who investigated it for him did the best that they could. They sent 2 detectives to the family home, the Argentino family home in New York, and they told her that the death was being ruled an accident. And one of the sisters, I think it was Louise, said that Snuka's promoter, they never named Vince McMahon, but he was Snuka's promoter. So basically, Vince McMahon called the family. They kept calling the family, asking if $25,000 would be enough to help them and to ease their pain. And the mother knew what was happening. The mother knew what was going on. And she said to McMahon, is that all my daughter's life is worth? You think offering me $25,000, that's what my daughter is worth? And she hung up on him. So the family sued Snuka. They took him to court. It was a civil lawsuit. Their argument was that he allowed her to go to sleep in that condition. He left her alone for 7 or 8 hours. So they won. They won a $500,000 settlement. Jimmy Snuka never paid a dime, not 1 penny. He claimed he was broke. He couldn't afford a legal defense. He had attorneys. They stopped working with him because they weren't getting paid. And he never showed up for any of his court dates. In all of this, from the civil suit to when he was charged 5 years ago, and then he died right after, but Jimmy Snuka never, not one time, stood in court to plead his case. And even the widow, they interviewed the widow here, and Snuka's own widow says he must have been given bad advice. He should have showed up. He should have showed up. So at this point, they talk about his career. They say his drug habit is out of control. It's getting worse. WWE decides to just cut ties. What a fall from grace. Here's a guy who was at one point the most popular star in the promotion, had the world by the balls, could have been a world champion or an IC champion, and to go from that to this, to being cut at the peak of what was becoming the rock and wrestling era, was quite a fall from grace. And so he started doing independent shows, and he went to different promotions, and they said he did what a lot of the retired wrestlers and older wrestlers end up doing. They hit the conventions, the autograph signings. He was doing that for a long time. He was also in ECW at one point. So they interview Adam Clark. Adam Clark is the Morning Call reporter who wrote the 2013 story. And a lot of the details that I'm fleshing out here that were not covered in this episode come from this article. I've read multiple articles on this, including ones from back then, just to kind of piece everything together. But there is a ton of information in this Morning Call story. So his boss was a wrestling fan, and he thought that this would make, I guess the boss thought that this would make for a good story. Look, when you're a newspaper editor, you're looking for a good story. You want a story that people are going to read, that is going to sell newspapers. What can we cover that would be interesting? Well, it's the 30th anniversary of this really unsolved crime that was committed, right? They never did close the case. It was unsolved. It was left open. And now it's the 30-year anniversary. There's a famous wrestler involved. Sounds like a hot story to me. So they couldn't get much information from the police because it was technically still an open case. So they went to the wrongful death lawsuit that the family had filed back in 1985. And in there, they found unsealed documents, including the autopsy report that had never before been released, that the district or the county or township or whatever refused to release. In the suit was a copy of the autopsy report. And the autopsy noted that head trauma was not consistent with a single fall. She died of traumatic brain injuries, consistent with a moving head striking a target or an object. She suffered more than 24 cuts and contusions, which they list in there as a possible sign of mate abuse, domestic abuse, on her head, her ear, her chin, her arms, her hands, her butt, her legs, her feet, all over her body. Imagine, how badly she must have been beaten to have marks and black and blues all over her body, literally from head to toe. And the final conclusion of the autopsy report was that in view of these findings and the discrepancies in the clinical history, I believe that the case should be investigated as a homicide until proven otherwise. And there it is. That is the bombshell line, hidden away for 3 decades. Conjure, the Keystone Cop I mentioned earlier, who does not come across well at all in this episode, is then shown a copy of the report. One of the producers hands him a copy of the autopsy report, and he's kind of thumbing through it. He says, "Oh, this is the first time I've ever seen this." And he's blathering on about something when all of a sudden the producer points out the coroner's finding. So then, the cop, he nervously laughs, and he just sort of explains it away by saying, "It was investigated, and we did everything conceivably possible." Sure you did. Now, at the time the reporter was working on this story, it just so happened that Snuka was coming out with his book. This was in 2012. Snuka had no idea that there were reporters working on a story about Nancy's death. He had no idea that that was going on. And in the book, it was the first time that Snuka had publicly addressed the incident. In his book, he wrote about a meeting that he had with the cops and Vince McMahon. He couldn't remember where it was, but it was at the DA's office law library. That's where the meeting took place. That's according to the Morning Call. This was on June 1st, 1983. So Nancy died on May 10th, I think. May 10th or 11th in 83. The meeting happens on June 1st. The reporter is showing us he's sitting at a desk. He's showing us all of the documents, all of the police documents. He says, unlike all of the other interviews that the cops did, pages of notes, there is a single page referencing the meeting on June 1st with Jimmy Snuka, Vince McMahon, and all the other parties that were in the room. And it's the only meeting that they did not take detailed notes on. They met for an hour, and there is no detailed transcript about what was said. In his book of the meeting, Snuka said, "All I remember is that Vince had a briefcase with him. I don't know what happened." The DA, who was in that meeting, recalls that McMahon was the one who did all the talking. Jimmy basically said nothing. Vince did all the talking. That's what he remembers. Beyond that, he's not at liberty to discuss. So they talked to Snuka's widow, and she wants to know also what happened in that meeting. And all Jimmy would tell her is that Vince came down with his briefcase when it was over. I guess he was waiting around, and here comes Vince. He's got his briefcase, and he tells Snuka, "It's done. It's over with. Don't worry about it." Now, we'll never know for sure what happened in that room. I can't sit here and tell you that this obviously happened, charge Vince McMahon. We don't know what happened in that room. What was in that briefcase, though, is one of those great wrestling mysteries that we're never going to get the answer to. I'm sure it wasn't a Money in the Bank contract inside that briefcase. And I said this before when I covered this on episode 399. I've talked about this on multiple episodes over the years. But one of the things to also remember, when I hear Vince McMahon briefcase, there have been stories told over the years by other promoters and people in wrestling that when Vince McMahon was expanding his operation and he was trying to put these different places out of business, and a lot of them were going to go out of business anyway, the territories and all this, he himself would travel to some of these places with a briefcase full of money. And he would basically go to the local television station and try to buy them off and say, "Listen, I want you to air WWF tapes. Don't air their tapes anymore. Here's whatever it is, $10,000, $25,000, who knows how much money he was carrying around, but there would be money loaded in these briefcases, and he would go from place to place and basically like bribe the TV station to play WWF programming. That's how WWF programming got a foothold in a lot of these different places. Now, there may not have been anything illegal about it, I don't know, but, pretty underhanded. But I remember that, and I remember hearing Vince McMahon briefcase full of money. And here we have Jimmy Snuka, who did not have to volunteer this information. Nobody would have known about this had Jimmy not volunteered this information in his book. And I hear Vince McMahon, and I hear briefcase, and Snuka says he came down, he told me don't worry about it, it's done, it's taken care of. What other conclusion are you supposed to come to? It doesn't look good. We know he apparently offered the family $25,000 to make their pain go away. He had the money to throw around, so all I'm saying is, it makes you wonder. It all just sounds very shady. And the funny thing is, again, like I said, Snuka did not have to say anything. It's not like it's a detail that makes him look better. So why would he make up something like that? It just gets people more suspicious, not less. He volunteered that information 30 years after the fact. So the police chief, who was not in that meeting, so this cop that they interviewed here on this episode, I want to be fair and make mention of that. I want to be clear on that. Of all the names listed in that meeting, and there were like 4 or 5 other people in that meeting, he was not one of them. But he says, probably nothing was transcribed because nothing important was said. That's his take on the situation. Obviously nothing important was said, and so therefore that's why there's no transcript. I wouldn't trust this guy to give me directions up the street if he offered them. I did find it interesting in searching, or I was curious about this guy. I'd never heard of Frederick Conjure before. So I looked this guy up. I was curious, like when did he start? When did he leave? When did he retire? What's this guy been up to? So I search around, I find that he was fired from his job as the police chief in 1992 by the township's new executive for, quote, failing to fulfill his duties. And the executive said, I felt that he did not adequately maintain the image I would expect of the chief law enforcement officer in the township. Boy, I can't imagine this guy being fired from his job for failing to fulfill his duties. He seems like he's got a good head on his shoulders, this guy. I'm shocked, I tell you, to find out that this guy got fired from his job. So after that meeting, the police interviews stopped. I think that was the last time they interviewed anybody, up until maybe 30 years later. But the case went cold. At that point, the interviews stopped, and the case went cold for 30 years. And in his book, Snuka claims he never hit Nancy, never even threatened her. Never threatened her. Interesting. So Nancy's family, they find out that Jimmy's writing a book. So of course they're curious to see what, if anything, he has to say about the death of their daughter in the book. And Snuka, among the things that he wrote, Snuka wrote that Nancy ruined his life. Think about that. The sister in the special even goes, she ruined his life. She ruined his life. I guess his image and everything, this story has followed him around all these years. Nancy ruined his life. Oh, the poor man. I feel so bad for him. She ruined this poor man's life. So they cut back to Tonga Kid. Tonga Kid, who admits that he was in the car with them on the way to Allentown. He remembers it. Yes, I was in the car. They ask him, well, what do you remember from that ride? He says, oh, we were having a good time. He's laughing. He's got a big smile on his face. Tonga Kid seems like a cool dude. He seems like a nice guy. He's like, oh man, I remember that was a great ride. Jimmy was wearing some nice cologne. He liked to smell good, so he was always wearing the cologne. And they got to the George Washington Motor Lodge, and they went to their separate rooms. Tonga Kid had his room. He said Jimmy and Nancy had their own room. And I knew exactly where this was going. I knew exactly what the producers were doing at this point, and I cringed watching this. They set this guy up. Nothing nefarious on their part, but I think they knew the answer before they kind of were asking the questions. But they're just trying to get the story straight here. So they asked Tonga Kid, they go, well, do you remember what Jimmy's story was about what happened to Nancy? And he said, well, and his demeanor changes. He goes, oh, I don't know what Jimmy told the police. So the producer tells him that Jimmy's story, about the drive out to Allentown, stopping on the side of the road, her getting out, and then hitting her head. And they asked Tonga Kid, do you recall that? Do you recall that story happening? Since you were, after all, in the car. And Tonga Kid says, no, I don't. I don't recall that. I don't recall that happening. He looked like a deer in headlights when he found out. And it almost looked like, and again, I can't get in the guy's head. I don't know. He clearly he was very close to Jimmy Snuka. Jimmy took him under his wing. Tonga Kid told the story at the beginning of the episode that he was getting in trouble. committing crimes. His family said, you're getting into wrestling. That's the only reason he became a wrestler, was to get him away from that life. And Jimmy kind of took him under his wing. So he idolized Jimmy. He was family. He was like a brother to him. And you see his demeanor change. And I wonder, and this is just me wondering, if it isn't so much a case of him lying or, making stuff up, but this is what really happened. He was a passenger in the car, which nobody knew previously. Certainly the cop didn't know. He was in the car and they had a great ride to Allentown. Maybe that's exactly how it happened. And when he's told by the producers what Jimmy's story was, and you see his demeanor change, and then he actually got up. He got up from the chair. He was walking away. They could have edited, the show that way. Who knows what he was? Maybe he was getting up to go to the bathroom. Who knows? But his whole demeanor changed. And I wonder if it was maybe something that clicked in his head at that point that made him, for the first time, really question, did he do this? Because that's not what happened. I remember, that's not what happened. And that's, if so, I mean, that's really sad, because you could tell, like, he beloved this man, and did not believe that he did anything wrong. He said, I can't imagine Jimmy being violent in this way and ever doing something like this. It was almost like his heart was breaking as he was being told this. That's at least how I was kind of reading it. So they talked to Conjure. They said, well, he didn't know there was a third person in the car. He's babbling, blah, 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 blah. He goes, we had heard stories, maybe possibly there was a third person, but no, I didn't know. And you need to watch his reaction. I can't even do it justice. You have to visually watch his reaction to this news, the way he's fidgeting around. This was quite the sight to see when he is told about this news. So after the autopsy report is uncovered publicly, there's a lot of pressure on the DA to reopen this case, which actually I think was technically never closed. And so in 2013, they brought it to a grand jury, and the grand jury felt that Snuka needed to face charges. So Snuka's arrested, and the reporter says, I had no idea that my story was going to lead to any of this. I was doing a 30th anniversary story, and it just turned into something much more. Jimmy's widow says he didn't understand what was going on. His health was so poor, he had no idea what was going on. And he would have been devastated if he was in his right mind and knew why he was there and what was happening. And the judge ends up ruling that Snuka is mentally unfit to stand trial. And Nancy's family says, we were at least happy to see that he got some kind of punishment, even if it was just reminding people of what he had done. At least it was something. They cut back to Tonga Kid. He's getting very emotional. He's crying, tears in his eyes. He can't believe, knowing the kind of person that Jimmy was, and when he would hang around him and they would have fun and they would party and all these different things, he can't picture Jimmy Snuka hurting anybody. And, they kind of end the episode talking about the fact that the real shame in all of this is that there was never any real final resolution, right? Her family never got the closure that they were looking for. There was never any final, firm determination in the case. Snuka, for his part, if he says that he's innocent and he never touched her, he never even threatened her before, he never got the chance to step into a courtroom and try to clear his name. 10 days when the ruling is rendered that he will not stand trial because he's not competent enough, he died. He had the stomach cancer. He was very sick. And so I don't even think it was a full 2 weeks later, he passed away. So he never would have been able to stand trial regardless, even if they moved ahead, because he would have died. And, Tonga Kid here was very, very emotional. He said, we lost a good man, he says. He loved Jimmy, and it really upsets him when people say these things about him. So Snuka's legacy will forever be linked to Nancy Argentino. There are people who are going to remember him as being this big star. They're going to remember the jump off the top of the cage onto Don Morocco. They're going to remember the coconut incident with Roddy Piper. Him being in the corner of the baby faces at the first WrestleMania. So he'll have these moments and these feuds and these legendary matches that people remember. But he'll never be able to escape the shadow of what happened here. Very Benoit-esque in a way, if you think about it. And the people who try to, kind of separate the two, separate Benoit the wrestler from Benoit the murderer. You can't. When you're talking about something as serious as, it's not like he, was drunk driving or something, or there was something that happened that, was an accident, or maybe somebody didn't die, but it was something else that happened in their personal life. When you're talking about murder, you're talking about people being killed. You're talking about people losing their life. It's a very different situation. You can't escape that. You can watch his matches, you can do all these different things, but his legacy will forever be tainted by this story. Ian Riccaboni of Ring of Honor tweeted this after the special aired. I guess he must live or come from that area. He says, "That dark side of the ring hits home. Not enough time to cover all ground. Embarrassed and angry that those in charge in Whitehall Township and Lehigh County at the time did not fulfill their obligation to investigate further. There could have been maybe a bit more closure years ago. There are plenty of rumors around here. I hope none of them are true. There are presumed open secrets related to the local government's handling of the May 1983 events that the Vice crew probably deemed too risky to put out with some sort of paper trail." The thing with Jimmy Snuka is he couldn't keep his story straight, right? That night he had different versions of, he had the one version that he changed his story. There were like 2 or 3 or 4 different versions of what happened depending on when you talked to him. And that was probably the biggest reason why that grand jury indicted him back in, I guess it would have been 2013, 2015, whatever year it was because of the conflicting stories. They also interviewed some new witnesses for that grand jury. They spoke with the widow of Buddy Rogers. Buddy Rogers died back in 1992, but they interviewed his widow. Buddy and his wife knew Jimmy and Nancy. Obviously, Buddy was Jimmy's handler for a while, but they were also next-door neighbors. They lived right next to each other. She testified for the grand jury that Snuka assaulted his then-wife later that same year. This was only a few months after Nancy died. She said the wife came knocking on their door because they were next-door neighbors. She said that her face was battered and bloodied, and she even took pictures. She took pictures of the wife's injuries back in 1983 that I believe she shared with the grand jury. So the grand jury would have been able to actually see the photographs. And Snuka's ex-wife also testified, and she backed up the story that, yes, Jimmy beat me up. Nancy never got justice for what happened to her. Snuka never had his day in court to plead his case. Either way you look at it, there was no justice here. And this case was either badly bungled or people looked the other way.